One of the common themes throughout the Gospels is the way that Jesus is consistently working to empower the people around him. Whether it's the way that he responds to 5,000 hungry people by telling his disciples to feed them, the way he responds to the woman caught in the act of adultery by lovingly telling her to go and sin no more, or the way he sends out his disciples to do the work of preaching the gospel and healing the sick themselves, Jesus seems to operate from a default setting that is looking to give people something to do with their faith. His stories, often called parables, reflect this mentality too. 3 servants are empowered by their master to take care of a sum of money while he is away, and are then rewarded based on what they did with what they were given. The servant who chose to do nothing ends up being chastised by the master. And in another story, Jesus celebrates the cultural outsider who chose to reach across social boundaries in the name of extending a helping hand, even when the religious role models failed to do so. Jesus wants to ensure that his disciples understand that their faith must lead to actions that look like love. This idea of an empowered, active faith is echoed by the leaders of the early church. Paul speaks of obedience that comes from faith, while James tells us to be doers of the word, not hearers only. The risk of choosing to only hear the word without acting upon it, according to James, is self-deception. He says elsewhere that religion that God accepts as pure and faultless is looking after orphans and widows in their distress and keeping oneself from being polluted by the world. He sums up his views most succinctly when he says that faith without works is dead. Throughout church history, though not perfectly, the body of Christ has only kept up with the charge to be people of action, living a tangible, practical, hands and feet faith. From the view of many historians prior to Christianity, the world did not have any grid for organized charitable work. It was the early church that introduced formal soup kitchens, hospitals, homeless shelters, hospice care, poorhouses, orphanages, reform centers for thieves, and women's centers for those leaving prostitution. It was the medieval church that started a hospital system to serve the less fortunate, as well as the first universities in Europe. And the Renaissance period gave the West a creative explosion that was largely comprised of artwork and music created for the church. In America, many of our universities began as Christian colleges, and the Puritans made education such a priority that the estimated literacy rate was 95%. In comparison, the modern global literacy rate is estimated to be 86%. The 19th century brought the advent of the founding of the YMCA, the Red Cross, and the Salvation Army, which William Booth specifically started to help those throughout London who were not willing to attend or even welcomed into a traditional church. Throughout the Industrial Revolution, the church was a major advocate for workers' rights in factories and for abolition movements around the world, even though there were factions of the church that found ways to biblically support slavery. And into the 20th century, the church brought the truth to the world in the form of the many human rights movements led by faith leaders such as Martin Luther King Jr. and Mother Teresa. The church across history carries a rich heritage of a faith that spurs followers of Jesus on to actions that benefit humanity at large. And there are many who continue to carry this heritage and the responsibilities that come with it into the future. Yet for many of us, church life and Christianity in general increasingly feels like it is being slowly overtaken by our consumerist culture. I once heard a pastor assert that we are the most informed church in church history, and while that would be hard to definitively quantify, it seems likely. Research shows that 1 in 3 regular podcast listeners are listening to religious topics. Thank you, by the way, for listening to this one. And in the midst of a 15-year decline in book readership overall, Christian book sales have exploded into a billion-dollar industry in recent years. To revisit James, he warns us that the way that we deceive ourselves is when we are hearers of the word only. James was living in a largely oral culture, but nowadays we get our information with both our ears and our eyes. And so to us, James might have said something like, "Be doers of the word, not hearers and readers only." But again, the research is not encouraging. Volunteerism in the church is down to 56% from its peak 10 years ago, when it was at 65%. And while volunteerism in or outside of the church is not the only way to measure the level of our faith's actionable application, it is what many churches push as their primary way for their congregants to make their faith actionable. Interestingly, it also seems to be what people are looking for in a church, as Gallup cites that lots of community outreach and volunteer opportunities is the 3rd highest factor that people look for when looking for a church, after sermons and programs for children and youth. In this season of Life Chats, we will explore what it looks like to move towards being a faith community that approaches the world as contributors to good, rather than as consumers entrenched in the self-deceptive patterns that James warns us about. Over the course of these conversations, we hope to provide some answers to the questions of, what do I do with my faith? And how does my faith influence the whole of my life? And perhaps most importantly, why does the application of my faith matter for the good of the rest of the world?